So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about topic 2.2, which is the industry and immigration in the United States. We're kind of going to begin with the first part, which is going to be the rise of big business. We're going to focus mostly on those large firms, which you remember from back in 2.1. The United States was industrializing, quickly becoming one of the main powers in the world. So we're going to talk a lot about how those industrial firms came about and then the problems resulting from them. So kind of the two of the focuses we're going to have today are going to be one, the actual corporations that rise, and then later on the unions that challenge those corporations. So for your objectives today, what you should be able to do by the end of these is you're going to look mostly at the different businesses that arose in the United States. They're also going to be called industrial concerns. And then we're going to talk about the pros and cons of those businesses, especially the monopolies. And then we're going to talk about how the government began to limit those corporations. So the vocabulary that's important for today first is going to be a corporation. In a corporation, a company is legally recognized as kind of its own person. It has its own rights, it has its own kind of structure, and it's treated as a person kind of by the government. So it is legally separated from its founders. We'll go over that more in detail, but that's just kind of the basics. A monopoly is just like the game where you are the only one that controls that industry, so you can pretty much charge whatever you want. A cartel is like a monopoly, but it's two or more corporations that come together to make a monopoly and control that market so they can charge whatever they want. Trust is going to be the one that is going to confuse you the most. A trust is where several different companies, and they can be from different industries. So they can be a steel company, an oil company, a company that makes barrels, a company that makes railroad ties, and they are all placed under control of one single board of directors. And that essentially turns them into a monopoly. We're going to see that a lot of companies use trust to hide their monopolies, and that's going to be what the government is going to fight against the most. If you remember back to all the way in modern world history in Unit 4, social Darwinism is going to be very important. This is that idea that everybody is constantly competing with each other and the strongest of those people will survive. We'll go over it a little bit more and we'll review it, but just know that they are going to apply this to corporations, and that's going to make kind of the cutthroat attitude that starts all the way in the 1800s. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act, we also go over that a little bit more, but this is going to be the law that is going to be used to bust up the trusts and break up all those major monopolies. So prior to the Civil War, most businesses in the United States were owned by families. You and your family would own, your shoe store or your grocery store or even your steel mill, and that would kind of be what it would be tied to you. So if the business actually went under and your family didn't have enough money, you would also lose all of your money. So the business and the person were one. And that can be a major issue because obviously if you're not making enough money with the business, you're not going to be able to get out of that business because it is tied to you. So in the mid-1800s, a new idea for business is formed, which is the corporation. And corporations are usually those really big firms, think steel, think oil, think railroads, and it's group ownership of a business where a bunch of people will come together to invest in one of those industries because they're so expensive. So imagine that you want to open up a steel mill and it costs $100 million. Most people do not have $100 million on them, so instead that person would put in $50 million, and then they would go get investors of $10 million apiece to also open that business. So all of those 6 people are now owners in that business. A corporation, one of the key things to consider is it is considered an individual by the law. So a corporation is completely separate from the people who found it. It is its own kind of, not a person, but its own kind of entity. This allows it to be separated from the owners if it goes under. So if a corporation goes under, you only lose what you invested in the corporation. You don't lose your personal fortune. So we'll go back to that example of the steel mill. If I put $50 million into a steel mill out of my $200 million fortune, and that steel mill goes under, I only lose the $50 million. I don't lose the $200 million. Unlike how businesses before the Civil War, it was tied to you. I would lose maybe all of my 200 million because the business and me are tied together. What this leads to is it makes corporations a limited liability for all the investors. The investors don't have to worry that much about losing a little bit of money here and there. The reason that corporations become very important is business is now conducted all across the United States of America. Even though a company may have its headquarters in New York, it may have manufacturing in Illinois, it may have distribution over in California, and it's selling products up in Montana and down in Texas. The key to this was the railroads really opened up the continent to business, and everybody could ship their raw materials all across the country, and they could get all those products to new markets. So the corporation is a response to how expensive business has now gotten. So the whole goal of the corporation back then, and even today, is to maximize profit. That's the goal. You want to make as much money as possible because that's why you open a business. The way that a lot of corporations do it back then is first and foremost, they use low wages. A lot of these jobs are unskilled labor. It's working on the line, it is mining out coal, it is jobs that you can teach somebody very, very quickly, and most people can do it. These people are paid maybe dollars a day, so it is not a lot of money. The other thing they do, and we're going to see this relates to imperialism, is they begin to look for lower priced raw materials. If I have a furniture making business and I'm paying $10 per foot of the wood that I use, if I can find it for $5 per foot, suddenly my profit doubles at the end of the month. So they're going to go out in the world, and it's not just even going to be the United States, it's going to be countries across the planet where they are going to try and find the cheapest raw materials they can find. The other and most important way that a lot of these companies are going to try and maximize their profits is getting a monopoly. So just like in the game, let's say that you get all the green properties, you can start putting hotels on it and charging as much as you want. That's the entire goal of a lot of these corporations. They have complete control over a product. They're the only ones selling oil. They're the only ones selling steel. They're the only ones selling shoes. And they can set the price, because if you can only go one place to get that product, they control the price and you have to pay it. What a lot of companies will end up doing, though, is forming a cartel where 3 or 4, let's say, oil companies, if they compete with each other, it's going to drop the price of oil because they're going to get into those price wars that we had talked about. But a cartel, they all come together and they say, you're going to make 50 million barrels of oil this year. You're going to make 70 million. You're going to make 60 million. And we're all going to try to charge $100 per barrel. They're going to make that agreement. What this is going to do is it's going to lower the supply of oil. It's going to set the price, and that's going to result in a higher price for you and I that we have to pay because they all made an agreement. So make note, monopoly is one corporation. A cartel is 2+ corporations. It is 2 or more come together. So there's 2 ways that monopolies can be formed in economics, and this is just kind of the very basics of it. There is horizontal integration and vertical integration. So at the horizontal integration, you got to think of it as, we'll go back to, we'll use Andrew Carnegie's steel company, okay? You cut out where you are going to buy your stuff to make the steel from. So if you need first iron ore, you are going to buy up all the mines that make iron ore. Next step, you are going to buy the railroad that brings the iron ore to your steel mill. And then you're going to own your own steel mill. And then you are going to own, the shipping company that ships your steel around the world. And I know the handwriting is not that good there. And what that does is it makes it so you don't have to pay at any of these levels for any of this stuff. So it drops your price, and it makes it so you have a monopoly on all levels of that good being produced, and suddenly it makes your profit go through the roof. The other and probably more familiar way of getting a monopoly is what's called horizontal integration. And this is where originally there would be a whole bunch of different oil companies everywhere, and they're all competing with each other. And as we've gone over, if you have a whole bunch of all these different companies competing with each other, they are all going to cause the price to drop. So under horizontal integration, I would buy all these oil companies like Rockefeller did and turn them into one oil company where I am the only company producing oil. And then you have to come to me for oil, and it makes me a lot of money because I can set the price. Lastly, we have a trust. So in a trust, you'll have a whole bunch of different seemingly unrelated companies. So maybe this one produces shoes here. This one produces coats. Okay. This one produces socks. This one produces, I don't know, skirts. And what you'll do under a trust is all these companies will be combined under one board of directors. And then those board of directors will run the company as a single unit. And they'll name it, whatever X, Y, and Z company name it needs to be. This is a way to get around the laws because technically these are separate industries and they're just being ran by a board of directors. So under a monopoly, the people who benefit are the corporations. The people who suffer are the consumers because the consumers are the ones paying the higher prices. So here it would have, if I would be in class, I would have you draw a vertical and integration and horizontal integration, but we kind of did that on the last slide. So you have those visuals to see. So the positives of a monopoly, the negatives, the positives are if you have the monopoly, you make a bunch of money. That is the positive. The negatives, it results in less competition, it results in higher prices, and it stifles innovation. If I'm the only one who makes oil and people have to pay that $20, a barrel, why would I ever look at a way to make it cheaper or make it more efficient? You have to buy from me, so I know that I'm going to get constant customers. So you can see here in kind of this graph, which is these notes are already uploaded on the Classroom. You can see the differences between a family-owned business and a corporation. One of the main things to keep track of, a corporation is public shareholders. People can buy pieces of that corporation, and it's a lot less personal than a family-owned corporation or company, sorry. So some of the famous people we're going to learn about, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he controlled at one point nearly all the railroads in the country. Rockefeller, he controlled pretty much all the oil on the planet. Andrew Carnegie controlled the steel industry in the United States. And J.P. Morgan, he owned at one point General Electric and U.S. Steel, which was Carnegie Steel's only competitor. Rockefeller had a complete monopoly. Carnegie was close. And like I said, his only competitor was U.S. Steel. So again, here's another example of vertical and horizontal integration, okay? This is probably even better than what I did, and it'll make sense of these if you need to study for the test. You can see here, okay, modern companies, all right? Companies that are horizontally integrated would be HP, the computer company, and then Amazon is the best example of vertically. And even now, like with their delivery service where they have their own trucks, they're owning every level of production. So this brings us back to the idea of laissez-faire economics. Remember that laissez-faire economics are hands off. Sorry, it froze a little bit there. They are hands off. The government does not deal with the economy. So under a laissez-faire system, the government would not break up monopolies. They would not worry about it because they believe that's not their choice. So this is kind of you to come up with. Laissez-faire does have some good things that it does, but obviously there's some negative things like the monopolies. So the pros and cons of big business. So during the early to late 1800s, monopolies, cartels, that stuff, they pretty much formed in every major industry, from the food industry of meat packing to farm equipment to, steel and weapons. And that led a lot of the owners that we just learned about to be looked at as either robber barons or captains of industry. Okay. So a robber baron is a negative connotation. All right. This is a bad thing. If you get called a robber baron, um, what it means is that you are hurting society. You're not paying your workers enough. You're taking advantage of people. You're destroying the economy. You're a negative. A captive in industry is somebody who uses their fortune for good. They, put money into their industry to find better ways of getting oil. They've made cleaner cars. They donate money to schools that are in need. So we're going to see that a lot of these, and the activity you're going to do along with this, a lot of these guys were both a robber baron and a captain of industry at the same time. They were kind of two sides of the same coin. And that brings us to social Darwinism. So Carnegie, Rockefeller, most of these guys believed in the idea of social Darwinism. So if you remember back to the theory of evolution, that natural selection is the way animals work. If two gorillas meet in the forest, they're going to fight. And the bigger, stronger gorilla is going to live. He's going to then pass on his genes of being bigger and stronger to his babies, and gorillas get bigger and bigger. So what began to be applied to business was that idea of natural selection, that the companies that were more fit, they were more ruthless, they were run better, they would buy up the other corporations because they were just naturally better. And wealth was a measure of being better. So Rockefeller going to an oil company and saying, I'm going to buy you out for $50 million, or I'm going to put you out of business, just proves that Rockefeller was the better oilman and he deserved all that wealth. He deserved all that stuff that he had. So social Darwinism created that very intense competition that we see in the late 1800s to early 1900s in the United States. You can see here, this is kind of the social Darwinist idea that you have the fat, rich people on top. These are supposed to represent all the monopolies and the trusts, and their workers are here underneath being crushed by them. You can see the different industries kind of labeled. But these factory owners are supposed to be on top because they are naturally better, they're tougher, and they're the ones that are being naturally selected. So the government began to catch on quickly to these different kind of things that the corporations were doing. And one of the first to kind of bring issue to it was the railroad companies. They were fixing prices and doing what's called pooling. So they would force all the other railroad lines to agree that they would all charge $60 to run a line from Houston to Bozeman, Montana. And then they would only allow so many trains to run in that line. And we know, law of scarcity, if you have only a certain amount of something, the price goes up for it. And that causes a lot of issues because people can't go find other trains, okay? So these secret agreements began to make people mad, and the government began to look into if they should finally begin regulating these railroads. And this really came in contrast to the laissez-faire attitude of the United States government, where it used to be completely hands-off for business. So what began to happen, the government actually began to look at the corporations and try to make business a little more fair. So the first thing that was founded, you'll see it abbreviated as the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this is to oversee the railroad operations and shipping rates. They said that the railroads are necessary for the United States, so they had to provide fair shipping rates. And if those rates went over a certain amount, the U.S. government could come in and actually break that corporation up. The more important one that you should star is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was the first act that allowed the government to go in, find those trusts and monopolies, and break them up, because they said that the monopolies were making it so you couldn't have free trade, you couldn't have capitalism in the country, because only one company controlled all that trade. The issue with the Sherman Antitrust Act is, first, it wasn't enforced. We're going to learn that there was a lot of corruption during this time period, so lawsuits weren't brought against those corporations. And it was actually used to break up the labor unions originally. We're going to go over labor unions later on. They're very important. But the Sherman Antitrust Act is an important step towards breaking up those corporations, like eventually Standard Oil and U.S. Steel will be broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act and sold into different pieces. So there's the Sherman Antitrust Act here, okay? It does allow Congress to regulate trade in the United States, but it was very vague in what was a monopoly and what wasn't a monopoly. And there will be other acts that we're going to learn about that kind of made it a little clearer what the government could actually go after. So what you should be thinking about at the end of this lesson is evaluating, was big business a positive or a negative for the United States? There's definitely some good things. Products became cheaper. The United States became an industrial power. A lot of these corporations quite literally built the roads, bridges, cars that we use today. But the negative side is workers were treated horribly. We'll learn that Carnegie actually shot his own workers at one point, and the monopolies began to become so powerful that they actually corrupted the U.S. government. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know when I'm back, and I hope this lesson made sense.